Welcome to Apologetics 101. I'm your host, Christian apologist Brian Keith Bowen. Today we come back with another debate review. This time the debate is between Matt Dillahunty and uh, a guy by the name of Tyler Vila, someone who I've never really heard or understood about and that sort of thing. This is actually the first time I've ever heard of him. My understanding from what he says in this video and what others have said about him, he's a Calvinist. Um, Braxton Hunter said he's debated him before on the subject of Calvinism, I think. But he's a Christian and he has a debate with Matt Dillahunty concerning if there's good evidence for the existence of God. And this is on Modern Day Debate. Again, when I originally asked James Coons, the host of Modern Day Debate, if I could get permission from to do the debate review video on his that he did of a debate on his channel between Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Jonathan McClatchy, he not only gave me permission for that, but he opened the invitation to do other debate reviews on his channel too. So this is what I'm working off of there, because so this is being used by permission because James Coons did give me permission and open invitation to do other debate reviews on this channel. Of course, this channel deals with a lot of other issues that's beyond the scope of what my channel deals with. But when it comes to religious questions and things like that, this channel deals with that. All right, and this has to do with good evidence for the existence of God. The debate was actually really good. I thought Tyler did an excellent job. In fact, Tyler did one of the best jobs I've ever seen at really hashing out the problem areas of his epistemology, which is actually what I wanted to focus on. This will not be like past debate reviews I did. Past debate reviews I did like from beginning to end. You know, in the debate that Matt Dillahunty did with Jonathan McClatchy, I did it as a video series in the form of 5 videos. This one is not going to be that. It's going to be a single video on the debate review, except I'm only going to do a particular segment of it, specifically targeting where Tyler actually targets Matt's epistemological framework in his not knowing what would convince him and not having falsification for his views and things like that, because I think that's important to discuss. Braxton Hunter also did a debate review. Actually, this is how I discovered this particular debate, because I actually didn't know about it until I saw his debate review when I was doing some research, make sure I understood Matt Dillahunty's epistemology before I did a video on his epistemology on my series on the arguments of Matt Dillahunty, my open-ended series, in which case the last video I did on that was on his epistemology. And because this targets his epistemology, and because a lot of the stuff that I said in that epistemology just started coming out. In fact, it started coming out so well that Braxton Hunter said something in that debate review that was very similar to something I'd already said. He basically said that, what if nothing can convince you? What if nothing can convince Matt? Sort of God taking away his libertarian freedom. And I said something similar to that. I said, what if God knows exactly what would convince you, and it's nothing? Because of the way you set your epistemology up, so no matter what, nothing could ever be proven to you. And Tyler got this. He just nailed it. And he starts challenging him on it, and he keeps pushing on it all the way up. And this is part of the segment I usually refer to as Crossfire. It normally is referred to Crossfire. I think James Coons usually calls it the open dialogue. Either way, open dialogue, Crossfire, same thing. It's just where they can interact with each other and go back and forth. And it's only a section of this, okay? So I'm not going to be doing the whole Crossfire open dialogue section. I'm not going to be doing with the whole debate. I'm not going to be doing the Q&A, the opening case, anything like that. This is more specifically geared toward this part of the debate, because I thought that Tyler did an excellent job of really hashing out those problem areas and bringing that out. I think he did an overall good job on this debate. Um, of course, I'm not a Calvinist and I don't do Calvinism, but um, but I think that Tyler did a really good job with this hashing out the problem areas of Matt's epistemology and his lack of falsification for his views and that sort of thing. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna play that for you, and as I'm going along, I'm gonna make comments on it and responses. Now, there is a segment that Braxton has on his that I won't be having on mine because it has to do with one of the questionnaire and asked about slavery in the Bible and or asked about what you would change. I think the questionnaire asked about what you would change in the Bible and Matt said just by everything else I would reverse his position of slavery because he thinks that the Bible condones slavery, but it doesn't. And I've actually read the passage. In fact, I've been doing hours of Bible study the last couple hours, looking it up, looking context, looking at the Hebrew, because I can actually translate Hebrew. And so I went into that, and the Hebrew word used for property there, it's not actually property. That's from the King James Version. All other Bible translations, like the NIV, for example, a lot of times will translate as money or silver, because that's how it's actually translated. The Hebrew word there is kesef, which means money or silver in the Hebrew. I've got this right here. This is in my Hebrew studies. I always consider this my pride and joy. This is the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew Lexicon. It's actually the top of the line scholarly Hebrew lexicon. Put together by three of the top scholars in the subject of Hebrew in that day and age, and it's for that era, and it's been updated ever since. It's actually very, very good, and I actually have it marked here. All right, it is Kasef, and it is translated. Let's see if I can. If you can see it or not, I see it backwards, but it's silver money is what it says there. Okay, that's actually the translation. Now, Matt, of course, says, oh, well, we're not property. They're not property. The Bible calls them property. No, the King James Version calls them property. The Bible doesn't call them property. The Hebrew there is silver or money. It's just talking about the money that's gone into them. It's really not even talking about slaves. It's talking about a type of servitude where it was voluntary. In fact, verse 16, this was brought up by Braxton Hunter. I looked it up too. Verse 16 of that same chapter says that if anyone kidnaps someone, and that's what slavery was when someone would kidnap one, and against their will into it. God said that they should be put to death. So the Bible doesn't condone it, and it never says it's okay. Matt said it said okay. I haven't read the comment section in that video section, but Braxton Hunter said that people in the comment section calling Tyler a liar, which wasn't true, and it isn't true. Tyler was telling the truth. It does not say it's okay. I've read the passage myself. So yeah, but I won't be dealing that specifically as much because I do plan on doing a video, and even before I saw this debate, I was planning on doing this for a while because I've had some atheists in the comments that would claim that the Bible's immoral and have immoral claims in it and stuff like that, which is kind of ironic because to have a foundation to call something immoral would need the existence of God, because otherwise it would be subjective anyhow. But they're not trying to see it that way. And so, but they claim that the Bible has, these immoral acts in it, and I thought it'd be cool to do a video series targeting these specific things that skeptics think are immoral that are in the Bible, and addressing those. And so, and this is probably top of the list, really. The alleged slavery thing in the Bible. It's not actually talking about that at all. And if you read it and you understand the original language, you understand what's going on here. Yeah. Um, but uh, Matt has this thing where he thinks it better is, and I plan on doing a later video of that video series. That's why I didn't really target it here. I may even show that clip specifically later in that video series of what Matt tries to say about that, about the whole slavery issue, which he thinks exists in the Bible. Um, and I'll deal with that at that point. But this particular video, this particular debate review, I want to mainly focus on Matt issue concerning the principle of falsification, because he won't falsify. He doesn't have anything that falsifies position. Okay, and of course his epistemological framework in reference to what would convince him and him not being convinced. And I think that Tyler did an awesome job of bringing that out. And I know it might not seem to go anywhere because Matt talks in circles and is very inconsistent. And one minute he says one thing, and next minute he says something else. And you'll see that as we're looking at this video. And that's just that's unproductive, really, because it's like you say one thing, but then when I challenge you on it, you'll say a different thing, and then when I challenge you on that, it causes him to bounce around to confuse his opponent, so it makes it look like he has a case when he doesn't, because he doesn't want to be challenged. Because once he gets challenged, whatever he said or whatever he asserted falls apart, which is a problem for him at least. But yeah, that's why I wanted to focus on here. Because see, Christianity is falsified. It doesn't mean it's false. It just means falsifiability just means they could be proven true or false. We have a way of proving it true, the resurrection. We point to the resurrection as proof that Christianity is true because of the overwhelming evidence that shows that Jesus did indeed rise again from the dead. All right. And a strong historical case, and I've made it, and lots of other people have made it, a strong historical case can be made for Jesus' resurrection. And so we have that. We have evidence for the existence of God. You know, to falsify Christianity, I mean, if you find the body of Jesus, that would falsify it. If you show that the evidence for the existence of God isn't as strong as I think, or that God's or that you can show the universe coming into existence without the need of God. I mean, actually demonstrate that the universe can pop into existence no matter what. It's falsifiable. We give you a way to falsify Christianity and Christian theism. Does Matt have a way of falsifying his views? No, because when he's asked about it, he says, "I don't know." He says, "I don't know what would convince me." And then he blames God because he doesn't think it's that God created enough evidence for him to believe, or in such a way that he wouldn't be able to explain it away with something else. We're going to get into that more and deeper as we continue in this review. But I just wanted to give you the preliminaries. Now, also, we're not going to touch on this at all, but basically, Tyler was giving a argument from existential or from a transcendental facts of reality. These are like laws of logic and stuff, person, mind, things like that. And he argued for their existence, such as I think they were mostly focused on the laws of logic, that where they come from, they have to have a spaceless, immaterial, timeless, type of origination. So natural, the physical universe couldn't explain or account for why these facts just are. They would have to have an original source for them. So it would be like that. So basically, he argues from these. And now a lot of apologists over the years have actually argued over this about the laws of logic would only make sense in light of God's existence. Because if we're just evolutionary random chance processes, physical, chemical reactions, electrical synapses going off in our brain. And I was talking to somebody in the comment section on one of my videos about that as well. Then, I mean, we wouldn't be able to trust our thoughts. We would never be able to trust our thoughts. We would not be able to ration out at all. A lot of Christian apologists have said this, such as Frank Turek, for example. Now, do I normally use this type of argument for the existence of God? No. I usually use the more traditional arguments, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument. Those are usually the ones that I usually use whenever I'm dealing with the existence of God. I think they're very strong and they're difficult to try to get through, even if skeptics want to. They try to respond to these arguments, but they can't really respond very well to them. Especially when it comes to teleological argument, especially when it comes to things like specified complexity. They just don't have a very decent amount of responses to it. The evidence for it, though, is very, very strong. I like teleological arguments, obviously my favorite. It's the one I use the most. But anyway, that's the usual argument that I would bring. Now, that doesn't mean I have a problem with the kind of argument that Tyler had brought. I thought Tyler did an excellent job of stating out his case. I thought he did an excellent job of arguing for it. I thought he did an excellent job of hashing out the problem areas that Matt's argument had. And we're going to see this as the time goes on. I don't want to get too ahead of myself. I didn't do notes this time around. I went through this debate, a few times, and I thought, I pretty much got this down. I know how to respond because it's an easy response, and because Tyler does an excellent job of responding to these things. And so we're going to check that out, and then we'll close up the video. This will be a one-shotter. There won't be a series with it. All in one video. Thank you. Let's on with the debate.
So one of the frustration I have is then when I push back and say, okay, let's go tabula rasa, right? Let's pretend let's go wholly on your evidentiary standard, right? Let's go repeatable, independent, tied to a hypothesis, can't be vague, and it has to be falsifiable.
For those things so I'm not talking about abstractions. I'm not talking about, okay, go ahead.
Good. So if I were to ask you, and I know, I've seen enough of your debates. I know you've been challenged with this before. This isn't going to be new. I'm not trying to get you a gotcha or catch you off guard. But I honestly didn't like your answer then. So I'll see if over the years it's gotten better. Is what evidence, right? So what evidence would falsify your epistemology or serve as what you considered good evidence for God if, and you can correct me, this is something that I think is built into your system. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I think that built in there, because you said things like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which I think is not true. But if you think that a natural explanation is always intrinsically more plausible than a supernatural explanation, because we have direct evidence of other like natural explanations, and on your view, we have no direct evidence of supernatural explanations. Right? That seems to be an assumption. It's very Humean assumption that natural explanations are always intrinsically more plausible than supernatural ones. Right? My question then is, what actually would qualify as good evidence that you would accept for the existence of God that could not simply be dismissed by saying it could be aliens, it could be our minds deceiving us, we're pattern forming, it could be anecdotal, right? It could be quantum weirdness, or, and you brought this up, or I don't know why. That could just be the way the natural world is. Right? If all of those are more plausible in your epistemology, then God did it. What evidence could ever be counted that would falsify your epistemology?
Sure. So there was a lot early on that got confused. So I'm glad you got around to the question of what it was, because you started off with what would falsify my epistemology, what would prove God. Then you went to natural explanations are intrinsically more plausible, and you don't think extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which is bizarre. So I hope that we can get back to that at some point. The answer that I gave, which you're not going to like, but I'll expand on it a little bit more, is I have no idea. But if there is a God, that God should know exactly what it would take to convince me, what it would take to convince anybody, and should be capable of doing so. It would be arrogant of me to think that I can tell the difference between a God and something that is so much more powerful or has a better understanding or is able to manipulate physics and do delusions. However, this is why I asked about whether or not God was capable of making himself scientifically verifiable. Because if he's not, then we're stuck forever. And if he is, then why hasn't he done it? To do this sort of thing where he presents himself in some sense that is undeniable, verifiable, it's not a problem that I don't know how that can be achieved. It's a problem that it hasn't been achieved, because I'm not the one claiming godlike understanding of the universe. You're claiming that there's a God who has that understanding. And so if there's a God that can demonstrably provide evidence of its existence in nature in such a way that I would no longer be able to say, hey, how do I know this isn't aliens? Or how do I know I'm not delusional? Then that is something that should have happened. But to suggest that my position on this of not being so arrogant as to think that I could rule out delusion or technology or whatever else is somehow problematic with my epistemology is fundamentally flawed, because now we're in this position. We're in this position because you think there's a God who created me, who gave me a mind and placed me in a universe where we cannot rule out those things.
All right. All right. I made a video recently on Matt's faulty epistemology. And in that video, I talked about how he blames God for him not being convinced of it. Okay, understand where Tyler is basically going for this is that Matt's view is not falsifiable. He can't falsify it. He says it's not his place to be able to explain it. He doesn't think he has to explain it. And we have data, we have evidence for God's existence. But I don't know is not an answer. It's not an explanation. And I think Tyler talks about that as well. It's not an explanation. It's really just a way of avoiding an explanation. It's a way to prevent you from having to have an explanation for it. And of course, you can always, and this is the point that Tyler is trying to make, you can always sit there and try to rule it out of something. If you really want to, you can always rule it out. No matter how strong the evidence is, you can always rule it out as something else, even if there's no real reason to believe it is that, even though the evidence is very strong in favor of the existence of God, you can always figure out some way to rule it out as something else. You can always do that. Because ultimately, if you really don't want to believe, you're not going to believe. And ultimately, that's Matt's problem. He doesn't want to believe. And so, he sets his epistemology up in a way that it cannot be falsified. It's just more like, I don't want to believe, you can't make me believe, and I will always rule it out as something else. But then he blames God because it's God's fault, apparently, according to him. Now, he'll explain this further, but he thinks it's God's fault that he's not convinced, because he thinks that God would know exactly what convinced him. Now, interesting enough, I thought of playing that clip too. But Braxton Hunter said basically the exact same thing that I said. in the last video, as well as in my debate review with between Jonathan McClatchy and Matt Dillahunty, and he said basically the same thing. Essentially, I think I said this in the introduction as well. He said essentially the same thing I said. That what if nothing can convince you? I mean, what if the reason Matt's not convinced is because Matt doesn't want to be convinced? Nothing can convince him. If you know, Tyler fixing to bring up the stars being rearranged and stuff. You know, if that can't convince you, what could? What could? And that's where that becomes a serious problem, because you have to have a way of falsifying it. You have to be able to have a sound epistemology. This is one of the things that make this reason why I added it in my video on Matt Dillahunty's faulty epistemology, because in order to have a sound epistemology is the study of truth, of knowledge. You have to have a way of ascertaining knowledge or truth. You have to have a way of ascertaining it, or say it's true or false. You have to have a way of being able to do that. If Matt lacks any falsifiability, if he has no way of falsifying what he is asserting, then his epistemology is unsound. And I don't know is not an answer. It's a avoidance of an answer. It's evading an answer. It's trying to avoid being challenged on it. We said, oh, God would know. Yeah, because you set your epistemology up in a way that nothing can convince you. And that's an issue. That's an issue. Let's continue.
Well, no, because you're basically what you said was, we're stuck forever, but that just assumes your epistemology. I don't think we're stuck forever, because I'm not a logical positivist.
How did you rule out delusion? Have you had an experience with a God?
Have I had an experience with a God? I'm going to say yes, but probably not what you're thinking.
I'm not thinking anything, because people are.
I want to continue my question, though, because this is why I don't like your answer, because you set up your epistemology as basically the scientific method, effectively, right? Would you ever consider a good scientific methodology to say, my thesis must be falsifiable, but I have no clue what the hell would falsify it? Would that ever qualify for you as a good scientific way to go about understanding a topic or coming to a position?
But that's not about understanding a topic. That is about the foundation. And so the fact that there are limits to the foundation is the very problem. I didn't create the universe. I didn't set things up so that there are a number of possibilities.
I'm not asking you that.
In incomplete knowledge. I'm looking at the universe and saying, look, how can I best understand? How can I best come to reliable understandings of this? It's not the fault of science that there's supposedly a God that works in a supernatural way that isn't testable or verifiable by science. That's not a fault of the scientific method.
Tyler isn't saying that there's a problem with the scientific method, and in fact, it's not what he's arguing at all. He's fixing to spell that out. Matt is misunderstanding what he's trying to argue, and I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional. If it's intentional, he's trying to avoid having to deal with the obvious challenge that Tyler's putting. Show me falsification for your position. What standard would you hold, to be able to consider evidence and be able to apply truth as a result, and be able to come up with a conclusion and that sort of thing. And you have to have a way of falsifying that. It has to be able to be proven false to you, if such other additional evidence is made available, because that's usually the best kinds of hypotheses. And Matt's avoiding that by, or he's basically dodging it. This could be unintentional, possibly. Maybe he just misunderstood where Tyler was trying to go with it. That's possible. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on it. But either way, he's obviously not answering the question that Tyler's trying to put forward. That's why Tyler's really trying to get this out. You'll see.
That doesn't mean that method, that epistemology is in any way flawed. What it means is that if what?
I'm not blaming, I'm not saying that's a fault of the scientific method.
It's the fault of the God.
No.
That's, yes, it is. If there is in fact a God, if there is in fact a God who sets up a universe where scientific methodology is the single most consistently reliable way to understand truth, and an absence of perfect knowledge and understanding means that we cannot, nobody's demonstrated any mechanism by which we can investigate the supernatural. They haven't shown that the supernatural exists. They haven't shown that the supernatural can interfere with the natural world. They can't even show that a God answers intercessory prayer or anything like that.
All right. The scientific method is good for what it was intended, but it has limitations on it. All right. I want you to understand the scientific method has certain types of limitations. It's only designed for being able to empirically evaluate the natural world and the universe around us. It's not an unlimited methodology that can just be used to prove everything. That's how Matt's taken it. A lot of other atheists in the past have taken it this way, but it's just not true. It's just not correct. There is a limitation on what the scientific method can prove. There's only certain things. And Tyler mentions, I think he mentioned it earlier in the debate, but Tyler actually mentioned this, that the scientific method, or the statement that all things can be scientifically proven, itself cannot be scientifically proven. In fact, that's actually a self-refuting statement. To say all things can be scientifically proven, it in itself cannot be scientifically proven. In fact, Tyler says in this debate that it cannot meet its own evidential standard. And I agree with him 100%. It can't meet its own evidential standard because it's impossible to prove everything can be proven with the scientific method. Now, Matt obviously tries to employ the scientific method into his epistemology. Well, a lot of atheists do, because they seem to see it as some sort of unlimited methodology that can prove everything. But that's just not the case. Of course, in my review of Matt's faulty epistemology, I didn't put the scientific method in there. I actually didn't even think about it. I think I did talk about his standard of evidence, about needing DNA evidence for historical figures and things like that, just impossible, unreasonable standards of evidence. That's probably going to stream a little bit, maybe a lot, from his epistemological views of using the scientific method essentially as his guiding post for, to direct what he thinks about, the universe and reality. As far as him saying no one can demonstrate the supernatural, basically this is circular reasoning. It basically assumes that the supernatural isn't real, because he says nobody's demonstrated supernatural. As soon as you provided evidence for it, such as the existence of God and evidence of Jesus' resurrection, he dismisses it and says that there's no demonstration of the supernatural. He actually assumes his worldview. This is pointed out, I think Tyler points out to it during this debate. I know Braxton Hunter targeted this in his debate review, which is a very good debate review. I recommend you go check that out. And by the way, I will be leaving a link to the debate, this official debate, in my video description. I would like you to see the whole debate. It's a very good debate. I thought Tyler did an awesome job. And of course, Matt lost this debate like he usually loses debates, because Tyler just shattered his argument. In fact, Tyler did an awesome job of just hashing out those issues. But in any given case, the way his epistemology is set up, no matter what, you will never be able to prove anything, Matt. And it isn't the fault of God that he's not convinced. It's his fault. And I mentioned this in this review I did of his epistemology. It is Matt Dillahunty's fault that he's not convinced. It isn't because the evidence isn't good enough. The evidence is there. He just dismisses the evidence. He doesn't agree with the evidence. There's always a possibility. In fact, Matt does appeal to possibility fallacy a lot in his debates. Well, it could be this, or I could rule it out as this. I mean, you could rule just about anything as anything else, unless you sit there and take evidence for what it is. You can't just simply rule it out unless you have reasons to think it's that. But he thinks it's, well, anything else is more plausible than the supernatural. And when people give him examples of things to prove whether or not, if examples of what would falsify his epistemology, he can't prove it. He can't prove it. He just says, I don't know. I don't know what would convince me. Maybe God knows. Well, maybe God does know, and it's nothing, because you set your epistemology up in a way that dismisses it. Let's say God did communicate with you. What would stop? And I think Tyler brings this up too. What would stop Matt? And I've brought it up before as well. What would stop Matt from saying it's a hallucination, a delusion? He thinks, oh, well, God would do it in a way that wouldn't. I wouldn't be able to dismiss it as that. How could God do it any other way? It's like Braxton Hunter said, short of taking away your libertarian freedom, how would he be able to accomplish that? Oh, well, he can do all things. Well, yeah, but he can't make you believe. The choice of belief, the choice of being convinced is up to Matt. This is why I said in that review of his faulty epistemology, it is Matt Dillahunty's fault. And this is also why I said it here as well. It's not God's fault. He blames God, but it's not God's fault. It's his fault. Because he's not believed, because he sets his epistemology up, because he's not accepting evidence, because he is closed-minded. And his closed-mindedness will also come out in this debate. And I've said this a number of times. But Matt Dillahunty is by far the most closed-minded person, most closed-minded skeptic I've ever seen before. And he'll bring this up, and I think Matt calls him, Tyler a liar because he brings that up, and he's not lying at all. And we'll deal with that when we get to it. I'm kind of moving ahead of myself, and I do apologize, but I really liked how Tyler hashed out these issues, and I mean, he went further than most people usually do. Most people usually challenge him on it in the back and forth and some debates, and lots of people have asked Matt what would convince you. I mean, over the years, and he always answered the same way. I don't know, but maybe God would know what would convince me. And he's given all kinds of examples. Mike McCona in his debate said, one of my head was cut separate from my body, but then without human involvement, my head was reattached. And I told you about a conversation I had with a dead relative of yours that concerned a conversation you had with them that nobody else knew about. Would that convince you? Nope. Braxton Hunter said, what if someone, meteorite, I think Mike McClellan brought it up originally, and then I think Braxton mentioned it too. Meteorite hits the moon, spells out, God exists in Hebrew, would that convince you, He said, nope. Let's continue.
There's no demonstration of a mechanism. If God has set up this system such that he and all of his machinations are separate from the way we look at the world to determine what is real and what is not, then that fault lies with God. And why would God ever do that for the single most important question anybody could ever consider? Why would it have a fundamentally different understanding that flies in the face of reason and evidence?
Which just begs the question that flies in the face of reason. I've given good abductive reasons to think that God is the best and only foundation for why we can reason in the first place. But I want to go back. I've asked you about falsification.
No, I missed the last part of your sentence.
I said I want to go back because I'm still, when you're saying a thesis, but in order to be reasonable, in order to be true, in order to be pragmatic, whatever it is, needs to be falsifiable. I keep going back and I'm saying, okay, Matt, if you have the opportunity to convince me, go for it. I'm going for it. I'm going to be a logical positivist. I'm down with you. but I need falsifiability. In order for me to hold this, to go full bore with Matt, there's got to be falsifiability in this position, right? It's not ego, it's not pride, it's not arrogance to know the falsifiability of your own position.
Falsifiability in which position? Because falsifiability is a component of the scientific methods.
Okay. You're using the scientific method writ large as your evidentiary standard for your epistemology. So I'm asking you, on your epistemology, what is the falsifiability of your epistemic standard?
A demonstration that something is true that doesn't.
Let me give an example. Let me give an example. Roger Penrose calculated that the chances of the cosmos, the galaxy, reorganizing 100% of its particles is about 1 × 10⁻⁸ power. Right? That's the.
By the way, that is more atoms estimated, more than the estimated atoms in the universe.
Chances that the galaxy will just randomly and spontaneous reorganize all the particles, which is somewhat terrifying, even though that's really beyond mathematical possibility. If suddenly some of the stars rearranged and said, Matt, I'm Yahweh, I'm here, would something like that, right? If you're asking for evidence, empirical evidence, would something like that count as evidence for the existence of God?
Yes.
Why? What is the feature about that? If you can say, well, I have no direct evidence for another God, but I have evidence that my mind is a pattern forming machine. I have evidence that this is mathematically possible in a quantum world. Why would you go, God did it, rather than any natural claim? Or, I don't know, but that's just a brute fact. That's just the way reality is.
So I don't know if you caught it, but when you asked, would that be evidence for God? I said yes, but that evidence for God is not confirmation of God. So would that actually count as evidence toward the proposition that there's God? Sure.
Would that meet your standard?
Is that sufficient in and on its own to convince me that there is a Yahweh God? No. And because there's a number of really good reasons for this, not the least of which is how do I rule out other possibilities? But because this proposition is absurd, and I get it from apologists all the time, and I've tried a number of different ways to point out why it's absurd, and I think maybe today, if I'm really...
It's not absurd, but we'll cover that.
Be lucky. I can get to how actually absurd it is.
Oh, by the way, in a little bit, Matt's going to take back what he said about he's basically said that there's evidence, there'll be evidence for God, but he says it's not evidence of God. But basically, Matt is again, he's talking out both sides of his mouth. Like Tyler accused him of, and I heard Braxton Hunter accused him of that once. He's basically being inconsistent, is what he's doing. One minute he says it's evidence for God, the next minute says, well, that wouldn't exactly rise to the level convince me that God exists. But yet it's evidence for it. Yet you're not saying that would ever convince you of it, and he kind of takes it back, but we'll see.
It never happens. It never happens. And yet these are the propositions that somebody comes up to say, ooh, would this count? The second thing about it is you have to consider what this looks like within the paradigm. So what we're saying is there's a God, Yahweh, and instead of directly communicating with me and providing incontrovertible, uncontestable evidence, which he supposedly could be able to do, he's instead decided to write in the sky with stars. This is an absurd proposition from an all-powerful, all-knowing, benevolent being who's trying to communicate with me, his own creation, supposedly. Why would he ever need to write stuff with stars in the sky when he can communicate directly with me in a way that eliminates the possibility of me saying, oh, that's technology or delusion or whatever else?
Right. Let me answer those 3 points, right? Never happens. That's the point, right? We're going to the farthest extreme to show
that your bias actually, you're not objectively open to these things like you claim you. If your position is actually, if you're saying what's good evidence for God, and I can say literally God could rewrite the stars, and you say, yeah, but that's not really good evidence. I'm just going to say, I'm sorry, I just don't buy that you're really objectively open to and interested in evidence.
All right, we're about to get into his closed-mindedness. This is something I've thought of Matt for a long time since I've started studying his arguments and his debates. That he's very closed-minded. But before we get into that, I want to point out what basically Tyler was doing. He didn't give it the name that it has, but this is the kind of argument set up when we give extreme examples like that. And I'll tell you in a minute, try to clarify why that, apologists have given him extreme examples. It's not that this is a normal occurrence or that it's something that might happen or would happen or could happen. Whether we're saying that, it being so extreme, is the reason why we're throwing that out there. We're saying if these extreme examples happen, would that convince you? And he's saying no. And we're trying to make a point about his epistemology, ultimately, that even those extreme examples won't convince him. Now, listen, this is a type of argument called a reductio ad absurdum argument. It basically shows that the assumptions and conclusions are absurd if we assume the same things. Ultimately, if I'm taking Matt's standard and I'm applying it, and I'm applying his epistemology, his epistemological framework, and I'm applying all these things, and when I do, and I give this extreme example, would this convince you? And he says, nope, it will not convince him. And when you ask him what will convince you, he says, I don't know what will convince me. Maybe God knows. So it's fault of God because Matt's not going to convince you. It's a way to try to put the blame on God, but it's actually not on God. God's not at fault at all. Because the one thing, there is evidence, there is good reasons for the existence of God. Tyler gave some here. I've heard Braxton Hunter giving good reasons for the existence of God. We have good reasons for the existence of God. Matt's rejection of these reasons or dismissal of them or ignoring of them doesn't change the fact that we have them. So we have this. He says it's not good enough to convince him because of the way he sets his epistemology up. But that's not God's fault. God didn't create his epistemology. He created his epistemology. He chose that epistemology. He set his epistemology up so no matter what, nothing can convince him. And so now Tyler is getting on to the point of how open are you to the evidence? How open are you to the existence of God? Because it's not really because he's open-minded and he's willing to look at the evidence. He has set himself up so no matter what, nothing anyone says to him can convince him. Then he has to blame somebody. He's not going to blame him. He's not going to blame his bad epistemology. So instead he blames God. As if it's God's fault that he has a faulty epistemology. That Matt Dillahunty isn't convinced. Matt Dillahunty isn't convinced because of one person. It isn't God. It isn't the Father. It isn't the Son. It isn't the Holy Spirit. It is Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty is the reason he's not convinced. And it's Matt Dillahunty's fault and Matt Dillahunty's fault alone. Let's go into this because I want us to hear what this back and forth about how closed-minded Matt is.
I'm sorry, if that level of evidence doesn't rise to your evidentiary standard, I'm just not buying it.
I already said that it would be evidence for God. I said it would be.
Immediately took it back and said, well, should it cause you belief? No.
It shouldn't. It shouldn't cause anybody on its own to believe.
Okay.
However, to say that I'm somehow closed to this or the possibility of this is an outright lie. Because what you would need to do is show that, hey, here's writing in the sky, or here's supernatural thing A. And we draw a line to demonstrate that it is undeniable that the single best explanation for this is that a God did it. I'm not close to that at all. You're not offering a pathway of here's this and this and this and this and this, and this is why this is most reasonable. You're just saying, what if the stars align to spell this out? Would that convince you on its own that there's a God? No. But would I be happy to say that that's good evidence towards the proposition? You bet. But there's still more work to be done. And even with that concession, your reply is, you're just closed to it.
Right. And let me explain, before cutting me off, let me explain why.
All right. Before we get into his explanation, Matt is closed-minded. Tyler, by the way, isn't lying. I mean, he really believes what he's saying, so he's not lying. It's not a lie. A lie would be, someone intentionally fabricating something. He really believes it, and I believe it too. I think he's right. That Matt is closed-minded to this. And you could just kind of tell that he's closed-minded to it. He says he's not closed-minded to it. He wants direct access to God. But even if you gave him direct access, he still wouldn't believe. He doesn't even know what will convince him at all. So yes, he is closed-minded. He dismisses the evidence all the time. I've seen him in debates on the existence of God. I've seen him on debates on the resurrection. And I've done debate reviews where he's been on debates. You saw that if you've seen debate reviews that I've done on this channel. And he just dismisses it without rhyme or reason. That's a problem. That's a problem. That's a very problematic epistemology, because he's setting his epistemology up in a way that he can't be convinced. Let's continue. Let's see what Tyler has to say about as he's explaining this.
Because when I say something, notice what you said. You say, would it be good evidence? Sure. But you need to show me incontrovertibly the link to God. And I'm going to say, okay, but the standard that you've set up eliminates the possibility of incontrovertible link, because you always could have any more plausible naturalistic explanation, or the out that you gave to the transcendent argument, which is, I don't know, but I have faith that this, well, how do you know this isn't just a brute fact of the way nature is? Right? You've given yourself that out such that no evidence could have that direct link. So let me keep going through your three.
Hang on. I haven't given myself any out, because the God proposition fundamentally changes that. If God is capable of providing that evidence, that is the out.
Okay, let me keep going through the claims. You then say, well, it's absurd, because why would God have to do all that out there when he could, speak to me directly with incontrovertible conclusion? Again, the reason I understand that the stars is hyperbolically absurd, right? I'm intentionally making it that far out, right? Because what you basically said is incontrovertible evidence could be something like what Christians claim as the intertestimony of the Holy Spirit. God communicating directly to you such that you could believe. Right. So my question is, because you're nodding your head, which I'm happy. But when I ask you, okay, great, you might think in this abstract context that that's good evidence. But then remember, you want to say, well, in order for it to cause me to believe, again, we're not talking about what in the actual world would compel you to believe. Maybe you believe for bad reasons, whatever it is. An accident might cause you to believe tomorrow night, whatever it is. We're saying what should rationally cause you to believe. You've said in order for that to happen, right, in order for that to take place where it should cause me to believe, I shouldn't have this evidence in the abstract. I then should have a scientifically repeatable, independent, direct link from that evidence to God as the best explanation.
That's not what I said.
Okay, then I misunderstood. I'm not trying to misrepresent you. That's how I understood you say it. You explain it differently then.
While I would, that is what I set up as the best, not what I set up as good or good enough to reach a rational conclusion. That is the ideal that we would go for, which I would argue should be achievable by a God. However, I've acknowledged, and I've done this many, many times, that independent revelation from a God could be, and you said could be, and I'm agreeing with could be, which is why I was not violently nodding, could be sufficient to warrant belief. However, as Hume pointed out, and I'm agreeing with, revelation is necessarily first person, and to everybody else it's hearsay. So your revelation does me no good. And so if Saul on the road to Damascus has a revelation that actually could serve, and I don't know if it can or not, I don't know what, because I didn't experience it, could serve as something that would be evidence that would warrant belief, why isn't a Damascus Road experience good enough for all of us? Why are we talking about writing in the sky? Why are we talking about, is there a grounding for the laws of logic? Or is, Alvin Plantinga, I know you didn't bring it up, but I love mentioning it because I like saying his name, but Plantinga's modal logic version of the ontological argument, all these things that a fraction of the population will ever remotely understand. Why is it this is what is offered for an abstract God? Why don't we all have a Damascus Road experience?
I'm not sure that it's necessary that we would. I disagree that there isn't sufficient evidence from all of the features of reality that I've described. So I simply don't agree with you that there isn't sufficient reason and that therefore we all need a Damascus Road. Plenty of,
yes, but you don't think extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, so it's not surprising that you don't agree.
Because I think extraordinary claims, as any claim, require sufficient evidence.
Yes, and the sufficient evidence for any claim is going to be proportional to how outlandish that claim is. If I say I have a pet dog, I don't need all kinds of evidence to support that. If I say I have an invisible pet dragon, that's a more extraordinary claim and requires more than just my say-so and the dog tag.
I'm guessing under you, both would just simply be present the dog, or present the animal. Actually, I think it'd be probably the same level.
Apologists would present the damn animal,
which I think we have. But I want to go back and say
the Damascus Road experience. Presenting the animal is the Damascus Road experience.
So,
that's riding in the sky, and it's not arguing about the foundation.
Then I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna say again for the.
All right. All right, I agree mostly with Tyler. I agree in part with Matt that the experiences can be subjective. I think Tyler thinks that too. He isn't arguing that. But Tyler's basically doing is he's assuming Matt's epistemological standard and arguing, okay, if I assume this standard, would this be good enough to prove it? That's what he's doing. He's not saying that he will be convinced simply by someone else having an experience, that sort of thing. Plus, he's also arguing whether or not if this standard, based on this epistemological framework, the standard would be good enough for me to warrant belief and be convinced that it's true. And then Matt saying, no, I'm not going to be convinced because I don't know what your experiences are. Well, yeah, experiences can be subjective if I'm trying to convince you. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have to be able to know about it. And he's saying, okay, I'm applying your standard here. Would I be warrant to justify my position here? And he's saying no. So it's like he's going back and forth. He's saying this is a standard. When someone meets that standard, he's still not convinced. See, Tyler's trying to look for a way to see if his epistemology is falsifiable. And so far, Matt has not given him any. He has not given him any reason to think that his epistemology is falsifiable. That his arguments, his conclusion, his beliefs, his thinking, whatever, it's not falsifiable. All right. He talked about extraordinary evidence. I want to talk a little bit about that because a lot of people throw that up at me. Extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is completely faulty. First of all, philosophers and epistemologists don't really. Tyler mentions this, that they don't really speak of that. They speak of it as sufficient evidence, sufficient to warrant belief or justify a position or something. And sometimes sufficiency evidence might be, the same level as extraordinary. The reason they don't say extraordinary because extraordinary becomes a subjective claim. Now, Matt will later, or in a little bit, He will actually admit this is subjective. In part, he will admit this is subjective. But what agrees with what is extraordinary to one person may be different for another. And I often tell atheists who throws this up at me, I say, what qualifies as extraordinary? What is extraordinary to one person may be extraordinary to someone else. Maybe something different. And Tyler brings this up as well. And I was actually really surprised and impressed that he brought this up, because I've said this countless number of times to atheists, that this statement, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, is in itself, it's not. The statement is subjective. It's not able to meet an objective standard, because to different people it might be different extraordinary. I mean, if a person believes in God, the idea that God can work a miracle or even suspend or transcend a law of the universe that he created, that's not impossible feat for God. That's not something that he can't do. But for an atheist who believes in naturalism, who believes this is all there is and there is no God, then to him that this is impossible, to transcend those laws or something of that nature. And so they don't view miracles. And so what actually counts as extraordinary is just going to depend upon the person who makes a statement. It's just a subjective standard. And Tyler nails it. I mean, he just hits right on it. And I'm like, wow. I said that a number of times in debates I've had with atheists on the comment sections of these debates and stuff. And I've told them, extraordinary is a subjective term. What constitutes as extraordinary? What's extraordinary to one person may not be extraordinary to other. And you know something? I've never really heard an atheist ever come back with anything. They usually end the statement at that point. They don't continue on, throwing up the same statement on that. As soon as I say that, it's done, usually. And it was kind of nice to hear that Matt, in part at least, agrees that this can be considered subjective. So that's interesting that he's recognizing that. Of course, he still thinks that that's the correct epistemological way of viewing reality, but it's not. And philosophers usually don't even, like Tyler said, usually don't use the word extraordinary. They usually say sufficient. They usually want the evidence to be sufficient to warrant justification, because the idea is that it's able to rise to the level of proving something, not necessarily that the fact that it sounds incredible to me means I'm going to require a little bit more because of how incredible it sounds to me, because that's subjective, because different things are going to sound different to different people. And so that's why philosophers don't use that type of deal. They talk about the sufficiency. The evidence needs to be sufficient to warrant the conclusion, rather than being extraordinary. So I'm glad Tyler brought that up, because I've been saying a lot of that stuff for a while on that statement, because I have atheists all the time that sit there prove that at me, and it's just a subjective standard. I mean, what determines the standard to determine what's extraordinary? Well, obviously the person does. And for Matt Dillahunty, and what Tyler's trying to show is that nothing can convince Matt, and he is closed-minded about it. I'm not lying about it. I really am convinced he's closed-minded based on my investigation into his arguments and my research of, seeing him in debates and stuff. I absolutely am convinced he's closed-minded. Even if I was wrong about that, that wouldn't make me a liar. But he sure is. I don't think I'm wrong about this at all. He is closed-minded. He dismisses the evidence. He ignores it a lot of times even. So We're going to continue on this.
The Damascus Road experience, again, you said, well, Hume points out we're very good at, lying to people. Hume also points out we're very good at lying to ourselves. He's going to say it's more plausible that we're deceived than not. So again, if you have a Damascus Road experience, it seems like you're saying the only way that God could convince me is by compelling me to believe based on what I would otherwise consider really bad evidence.
Yes.
Right. So.
Wow. Yeah, he will be very convinced on bad evidence. That's sure. Basically, he's being inconsistent. At one point, he said, "Yeah, I'm going to do this, adopt this, and have this kind of standard." When he gets challenged on that, he says, "No, I need this." He said, "I want direct link, but that's not really good enough evidence to warrant that position."
What you're saying is the best evidence is bad evidence.
Well, no. What I'm saying is that God should be capable of overcoming that hurdle and compelling belief.
Yeah, capability isn't the problem with the argument here, right? So I'm again going to go back and say we still have nothing approaching falsifiability for your position, right? We still have an unfalsifiable standard, an unfalsifiable epistemology, an unfalsifiable worldview. Because no matter how much evidence, again, it could be stars in the sky, it could be God speaking to your heart, it could be Damascus Road experience. It could always go back to, well, I was hallucinating, well, I was delusional. Well, Hume tells us that it's more plausible that we're delusional and lying to ourselves.
Yes, Hume is talking. So you asked about the falsifiability. I provided you an answer for that. Hume is talking about the world in which we inhabit, and I'm in agreement with you. That is separate from whether or not, if there is in fact a God should be able to overcome that limitation. If he can't, then he created a flawed world that he cannot achieve what his goal is.
That's if you do that, if God created a world, therefore he would therefore overachieve it. God didn't overachieve it, therefore God is. That's just not only would I reject the propositions, but it just doesn't logically follow that therefore the world is flawed. Right. That's not a logical position to hold.
The world we inhabit is flawed. We are imperfect thinkers. We have limited access to.
That's not what I'm saying. We agree that there are flaws in the world. It doesn't mean that it's tied to some type of God would otherwise have made it such and such. Right. That would have story, but that would have.
Okay. So what you're arguing for is kind of like a computer programmer designing sim people that he cannot instruct or interact with, and then blaming them.
Nowhere did I say cannot.
Well, he has not.
I don't agree that he has not. I think there are millions of Christians the world over that would disagree with you that he has.
I know there are people who would disagree, but they don't ever present any evidence. They just present opinion.
Right. But notice now that you're back to begging the question of that there is no evidence. And when I say, okay, well, what could count as evidence to falsify that? You have no falsification standard. And I could say, I could present you the stars in the galaxy. And you're going to say, yeah, but in the abstract, that actually shouldn't cause me to believe. And I could say, okay, but God could, by the interpestimony of the Holy Spirit, and you say, yeah, but that'd be bad evidence, right?
No, that's not what I said. That's what you said. I already acknowledged twice that direct revelation may well be sufficient to warrant belief. But absent that direct revelation, I have no way to assess it.
But you've said, when I say you're saying it's bad evidence, it's because I'm not saying that it wouldn't be compelling. By your own standard, it wouldn't rise to the level of what ought to compel someone, because the person would have to then say, well, that gives me direct evidence of God. And you're going to say, well, you need direct evidence of God to make that direct evidence to link. That evidence shouldn't, like the stars in the sky, you could be being deceived, you could be hallucinating. So that evidence on its own shouldn't lead you to believe reasonably.
No, that's not what I'm saying. It's weird that you keep saying I'm saying something that's not remotely what I'm saying.
Okay, so if I have a testimony of the Holy Spirit, to me. I have got it right. You're going to say that I then have sufficient warrant
No.
for my belief in God.
No.
You see how he's being inconsistent, right? One minute he says, nope, that's not what I'm saying. Then Tyler says, okay, if I say I have an inner witness of the Holy Spirit inside of me, is that good enough to convince you? Is that meet your evidential standard? And he says, no, it doesn't. So which is it? Does it or does it not? And I mean, almost in the same breath, he just reversed, and he's going back and forth. He's doing this thing when he gets challenged on one thing, he goes to a different thing. When he gets challenged there, he goes to there. And he just goes back and forth. He's just all over the block with his argumentation. It's bad. It shows that when Matt is challenged on a point that he's making, he'll go somewhere else and look like he's not making that point. But then when he gets challenged there, he bounces back to that point again. And he'll keep going back and forth in circles so that it confuses his opponents and that they can't make heads or tails of what he's trying to argue. Usually arguments are straightforward. I have a position. I'm arguing for that position. I'm giving reasons why I think that position is true and valid. Okay? That's usually the way arguments go. That's the way that people argue for the positions, the way they present their case, etc. The way Matt presents his case, he argues for one thing, and then when you challenge him on it, he starts arguing for a different thing. He says, "Oh, I'm not arguing. I'm arguing for this over here." And you challenge him from that, he'll say, "No, I'm arguing," and he goes all over the place with his argumentation. It's a terrible way to argue, because you might succeed in confusing your opponent who's used to straightforward arguments. Go from your arguments and your evidence to the position or to the conclusion, which then voices your position. But for somebody that's watching a debate between two different individuals, trying to understand what is Tyler's argument, what is Matt's argument, it really confuses the pot. It really just kind of just messes it all up because he's going all over the place with it. And Tyler challenged him on this, and Tyler's going to note that they're going in circles. In fact, that's why they in the crossfire section. Well, one of the reasons. The other is that they get close to time, but they're just going in circles on it, and they'll keep going back and forth like this. But it's just crazy. I mean, it's an improper way to argue. I don't. When I get in debates with people, I don't do that for my benefit. I don't do it because I want to show how smart I am or how right I am. None of that stuff really is what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to humiliate somebody. That's not my goal either. My goal is ultimately truth. Okay. But I want other people who've seen the debate to benefit from this discussion. But they can't benefit from it if somebody like Matt is just all over the place with the way he's arguing. And to try to pin down exactly what he's arguing, and then for him to just go somewhere else, and he pin that down, he goes somewhere else. It's a confusing way to argue. It does people like me no good who's trying to figure out what Matt exactly argued. And he's trying to confuse his opponent, which doesn't work very well because Tyler's picking up on this. He's picking up on it. He's arguing in circles. He's being inconsistent. One minute he's arguing one thing, next minute he's arguing something else, and he's picking up on this. So this is good that Tyler picks up on this and voices it, because this is exactly what Matt's doing.
Why? You just said that would be good evidence.
You're not catching it. I said that a direct revelation might be sufficient to warrant belief. I don't have any way to investigate your claim of direct revelation. It may, in fact, be sufficient to warrant your belief. It does nothing for my belief.
That's not what I asked you. I asked you if I had the experience, if I had the intro, is that warrant for my belief?
I don't know. What I said is I don't know what warrants your belief because I don't have that experience. I can't assess an experience I have not had. So when you said, you know, if you've had this revelation of the Holy Spirit, you suspect that I would say you shouldn't believe. And I wouldn't say that because I don't have a way to assess your experience. Unlike a lot of other people, even though I pretend to read minds on stage, I don't actually read minds.
I know. That's not what I'm asking.
All right, let me clarify something. Tyler is basically trying to get at what is Matt's standard. He's saying it's good enough evidence if God communicates to him. He's not saying, okay, can I convince you by the same standard that convinced me? He's saying, is the standard that is set, that he's setting, good enough for me to say, I have the Holy Spirit in me, it has guided me, it's convinced me that the truth of Christianity, God has spoken through the Holy Spirit, spoken through my heart. Is that good enough evidence? And Matt doesn't want to get pinned down on this. He said, well, this is not, ain't going to do me any good, ain't going to convince me. He's not saying that. He's saying, is it justifiable standard to convince me to say that I have warrant for this position? Because your standard said basically, and Tyler's not saying that he has a standard. What he's saying is that this is Matt's standard. And he's saying, okay, if I apply that standard, would that warrant belief in that? And he said, I don't know because I can't assess your experience. You see how inconsistent this is with his standard of evidence. See, this is the reason why I wanted to do this debate review, because it just really plays into that video that I made of Matt's faulty epistemology. And some of the stuff that they talked about and some of the stuff I saw in other debate reviews, like in the case of Dillahunty debate review, just matched what I was saying, both in that review of his epistemology, as well as in a debate review that I did of a debate that he did with Jonathan McClatchy on Unbelievable, or on the modern day debate. And they just nailed it. They nailed his epistemology. George, both of these guys, Braxton Hunter and Tyler, both have debated Matt Dillahunty. And so they knew what his arguments were. They knew how his epistemology was. And lots of people have asked Matt over and over and over again, what would convince you? They've asked him that every time. If I ever got in a debate, I would ask him that. Not just because it's traditional for everybody to ask Matt Dillahunty that question. No, of course not. But I would want to know, and I would want to make the point to everyone else, what would falsify his claims? What would, if his epistemology is sound, it should have a way of falsifying it. It should have a falsification. Saying, I don't know, because you're being challenged on something, to present that, and we have data, but you're ignoring that data and you're dismissing it as whatever excuse you want to make. Yeah. So he's just all over the place with his arguments. But I really think Tyler fleshed out his arguments in this. Let's continue.
Right? I get it. Okay. I asked, because you said, if that experience has happened, it may be sufficient evidence for warranted belief. Right. Okay. I'm not asking if you would believe that I had that experience. I'm asking if I, in my person, have what I believe is a veridical experience of the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit. I'm not asking if you think it's true. I'm asking, would that then, as a standard, be sufficient evidence for me to face and have warranted belief?
I literally just answered this, and the answer is I don't know how to assess an experience I have not had. So I cannot say whether or not the experience you had is or is not sufficient to warrant belief, because I haven't had that experience. That's what I said twice.
Yeah, again, and I'm not asking you to verify if it's true or not.
I didn't say anything about whether it was true. I said I haven't had that experience, so I cannot determine whether or not you are warranted.
Right, but you're saying there's a standard. Let's call it the interior standard, such that if the conditions of the interior standard are met, that would be good evidence to warrant belief.
But I have not had so what we're talking about here is a different standard. Basically, we have the standard of the world that we inhabit, and then we have God and what God can do to overrule that. And if God can overrule that, then God may well be able to give you an experience that does provide sufficient warrant, but it is unique to you. It doesn't do anything for me, and I have no way to assess that. It's not that God suddenly makes that God is providing you bad evidence. I'm not saying that. What God is doing would be providing you good evidence under a completely different standard that no one else can interact with or have any way to assess unless they've had that experience.
Okay, I think
it's like this is easy. If the other day, let's say I had amazing sex, because let's keep the channel fun. That's an experience. That's an experience that is mine. It's probably sufficient for me to conclude that, yeah, that actually happened. It'll never be that for you, no matter how many times I relay it. And this is a relatively mundane claim because we're talking about the subjective experiences. It's the same thing when we're talking about God giving a revelation to someone. It's not that it's bad evidence. It's that this is a completely different category of evidence. And I have no way to assess this because I can't read your mind. I can't know how you're thinking. What I can do is look from the outside and say, you're sitting here saying that you don't think extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I find that to be a monumentally flawed aspect of any epistemology, because what that means is that you can have an extraordinary claim and you would have lower standards of evidence for it than perhaps you should. You want to dump.
No, that would not mean that. In fact, Tyler said repeatedly, he talked about sufficiency evidence, and he even talked about possibly sufficiency evidence rising to the same level of proof that Matt's talking about here. The difference is that we're talking about one statement that has to do with something subjective, extraordinary, because it's a subjective language, it's using subjective language, because different people might have different things that would be considered extraordinary. And the other is using the proper terminology, sufficient, meaning a good enough evidence to warrant the conclusion, basically. And that is what Tyler's talking about. And Matt is wanting to say, well, you know, you can't assess my experiences and things like that. Tyler's not talking about that. Tyler's actually not talking about proving it to another person. He's not talking about that. He's talking about justification, and based upon the standard that Matt is setting. Now, Matt is setting a standard. He says, it will prove it to me if God directly communicates to me. Well, could not someone else think that that would prove it to them? He says, oh, well, it could be evidence for it, but it's not going to prove it to them. It's not going to grant justification, rational justification for them believing it. But it does. He says that could be evidence for God. Okay, that's fine. But he doesn't think it should rise to the level of convincing them. That's the point that Tyler's making. If you don't think that should convince me that it's true, then why do you think it needs to convince you that it's true? And we're not talking about going from one person proving it to another person, which is what Matt's talking about, but that's not what Tyler's talking about. Tyler's not talking about proving it to another person. He's not talking about what would convince another person it's true. He's saying, based on the standard that Matt has set, is it justified to take this position that it's true on the basis of an internal standard? Not that it's evidence, but is it sufficient to prove the thing in question using the standard that Matt is setting? And Matt keeps going back, oh, well, I can assess it. Okay, we're not talking about you assessing it. We're talking about whether I have justification for it or not. Whether you think I have justification for it or not. And that's what he's saying. Basically, what Tyler is doing, he's basically asking for an actual standard that Matt has, and he's trying to see whether or not if the standard that Matt's epistemology is set up is falsifiable. Can I prove it true or false based on the standard in which Matt set? And that's the issue. It's not falsifiable. Let's keep going.
Dodge that by just saying all claims have whatever level of evidence is sufficient to justify them, which I agree with. But the thing is, we would both agree that I would hope that there are some claims, like I got $1 in my wallet versus I have a legitimate check for $10 billion in my wallet, versus I have money from an alien world in my wallet. Those three claims have different, it's like, how do you prove them? There's different standards of evidence for it. You might not even demand any proof other than my word to the fact that I have $1. That seems intense. That seems reasonable because we know there are dollars. We know people have dollars. We know people keep their wallets. When we get to something else that goes beyond that, to I have alien currency from another world, merely showing you what I claim is alien currency, which is more than I would probably have to do for the dollar claim, still doesn't rise to the level of saying, yep, I can reasonably conclude that Matt has alien currency in his wallet. This is why I say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah, which again, just no epistemologist says because they say claims require sufficient evidence, right? Extraordinary, it adds a certain subjective evaluative nature to it. That's why I get away from it, because it just becomes subjective evaluation of what counts as extraordinary at that point.
But is it really though? Because if we both agree, no, hey, all right, yeah, go on then.
Yeah, I mean,
it is subjective, and Tyler's absolutely right. So, well,
depending on who you're talking to, having $100 in your wallet might be extraordinary. So,
no. There is a subjective aspect to this that one person might find extraordinary is different from what another person might find extraordinary. But in much the same way that we have a fair market value for things, if I tell you I'm selling my 73 Pinto for $487,000, virtually any reasonable person would find that to be extraordinary. And if I'm selling it to aliens for their currency, virtually any reasonable person would find that extraordinary. It's not enough to just say we need, matter of fact, it tells us nothing to say, oh, every claim should have sufficient evidence. I agree. That's a big nothing burden. But doesn't in any way mean that just because different people might value different claims at different levels of extraordinariness doesn't change the fact that they are, in fact, more or less mundane.
Yeah, but you're considering what a person would normally consider extraordinary, which is still subjective. So like I said, he agrees with this in part, but he isn't fully on board with it. He thinks that there would be a generality of understanding that it's extraordinary. They just might disagree on the degree of how extraordinary it is. But that's just not necessarily the case. It is a subjective standard. Like I said, I mentioned earlier, existence of God, for a Christian, miracles is, he can rise someone from the dead and create the entire universe out of nothing. Miracles would be nothing to a God that's able to do these things. And Matt, of course, don't believe in God. He don't believe he can do those things, and he don't believe God exists. Or I think he's a little bit agnostic on the subject of God. At least he says he is, even though he's considered himself an atheist. But he basically, he's not going to answer dogmatically that God does not exist. He just doesn't think there's enough evidence to convince him that God exists. I think it's how he words it. But in any given case, saying extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence is a subjective standard, because what qualifies as extraordinary for one person may not be extraordinary for another person. It's not extraordinary for me to believe that God is capable of miracles. If he created the entire universe out of nothing, miracles are nothing to him. It's small potatoes. It's easy peasy to him. I mean, it wouldn't take much for him to be able to walk on water and calm the seas and raise a guy from the dead. None of those things would be impossible for God. But for an atheist who don't even believe that there's all-powerful agent in existence that did create the universe, create the laws of the universe and so forth, to them, the idea of someone transcending such laws would be impossible for under their worldview. So for them, when they hear somebody like Jesus rose again from the dead, that's an impossible standard for them. Because and so they consider it an extraordinary claim. So the word extraordinary is very subjective. Depending on who you're talking to and what we're talking about, extraordinary could be different for each person. I'm glad he admits that in part, but it seems like he just ain't fully there with it. Like he's taking it back and saying, yeah, they might not agree exactly how extraordinary it is, but they'll agree to some degree that it's extraordinary. But that's just not the case. Some people might say it's extraordinary. Some people might say it's not. For atheists, they think any miracle is extraordinary. They think it's improbable. They think it doesn't happen normally. But for the Christian who sees miracles all over the world, thousands upon thousands of reported miracles, even in our modern age, for the Christian, this is not an impossibility for God. And it's not an improbability, because most Christians still think God is still working miracles. So, the point that I'm making is not to try to instill a debate over whether God's actually doing miracles or not. The issue is simply this, that the claim extraordinary is actually subjective, and it's subjective to whoever is setting the standard of what counts as extraordinary, which is usually the person who says it. So for Matt, someone rising from the dead is very extraordinary. But for a Christian who believes God exists and one raised Jesus from the dead, it's not very extraordinary at all. So yeah, it's just a subjective standard. And Tyler's right to point that out. I know it seems like he's arguing over semantics, because sometimes are you arguing for sufficient evidence, maybe arguing for the same level of evidence that Matt is arguing for. But the reality of it is that sufficient tells us that we're not looking for a subjective standard in which we're comparing the evidence with or conclusion we're accepting, whether we're saying, is the evidence good enough to warrant the conclusion in question? And that's ultimately what Tyler's doing here and what he's talking about here.
Which sufficiency covers, I mean, that just is a philosophical term for it. I mean, extraordinary is just as much of a nothing burger, because what is extraordinary is, well, you have a sliding scale that can go. The sufficiency has the same sliding scale. One's a nothing burger, the other one's a nothing burger.
But but extraordinary at least adds something about what would be sufficient.
Yes, it's being added by the person who's making the statement. It's not that the statement itself is adding what would count as extraordinary or not. It's being added by the person making the statement.
Sufficiency adds what would be sufficient. What would
No, it doesn't. Sufficiency, that's a tautology. Sufficiency and sufficient.
He wasn't providing, he's fixing to tell you this, but he wasn't actually providing a definition of sufficiency. Technically, if he was defining sufficiency as sufficiency, it would be what's called a circular definition, but he's not doing that. And by the way, Matt Dillahunty did a circular definition in his debate with Mike Winger, because when Mike asked him to define what he thinks evidence is, and he says evidence is evidence. So that's a tautology as well, but it's a fallacy in logical circular definition. You can't define a word by itself. but Tyler wasn't saying that sufficiency is sufficiency. He's saying that evidence itself is sufficient, that the evidence warrants sufficiency. He's just trying to understand that the word sufficiency should count as far as proving the thing in question is ultimately what he's saying. He wasn't trying to define what the word sufficiency means. That's not what he was trying to do. And he points that out here in a second.
And extraordinary is what's extraordinary.
But we can define that. You don't think we can sit here and say, hey, this.
And we can define sufficiency. He's going to mention this too, but I just thought I'd throw that in there. We can define what the word sufficiency. Now, Matt's going to deny that we can define sufficiency, which is really weird because he thinks we can define extraordinary, but we can't define what the word sufficiency means. Let's check that out.
Claim is mundane, and this one is much more extraordinary.
You don't think we can define sufficiency?
No, but
I mean, I would just at that point I would just push you to go read some philosophers of epistemology. Okay. A very clear way to define.
I push you to stop and think for a little bit.
Yeah,
saying sufficiency is sufficient is a tautology of a tautology.
That's not actually how I was defining it, but I still want to go back one last time. All right. Before they move forward, I just wanted to point out the fact that Matt makes a weird denial that doesn't make any sense. He doesn't really go into why he denies that, but it's really weird. He thinks that we can't define sufficiency. Does he not own an English dictionary? We can define what the word sufficiency means. It obviously means enough. To have enough evidence in contrast to what's being proven. Either we're talking about the amount or we're talking about the quality of the evidence that makes it good enough to prove the thing in question. That sort of thing. We can define what sufficiency is. And of course, I like the fact that Tyra said, I'll just point you to people that wrote about epistemology. I probably add philosophy in that too. Is epistemology really just kind of something that really shakes me up? I understand what he's trying to argue ultimately, but in getting around some of the challenges he makes, his epistemology winds up being self-refuting. It winds up being inconsistent. It winds up not having any kind of falsifiability. It winds up with all these kinds of issues that when he gets challenged on that, he's just all over the place with his argumentation. And it's weird. I mean, some of the stuff that he says is weird. Some of the things that he says, I'll be honest, some of the things he says in his debate reviews or debates that I've seen him in make no sense. I don't even understand why he's saying it. I don't understand why he's arguing it. We can't define sufficiency. We can find extraordinary, but we can't define sufficiency. It's like, where in the world is he getting this stuff from? All right, let's continue.
Because I still don't think we're there.
Oh, I know we're not there.
Because I'm not asking. I'm just going to keep going back because I'm not asking what would convince you that I have warrant, right? Warrant is if I have warrant, then I have warrant, whether or not I can demonstrate it to you. I'm not asking you if you have warrant to believe that I have warrant.
I agree.
Yeah. So what if your standard that you've set up is true? You've set up this. It actually ends up. It's this weird, actually double-edged sword now, where I might be able to say, well, internal witness of the Holy Spirit is sufficient to warrant religious belief, and I simply can't demonstrate it to you.
Correct. I'm in agreement.
Right. So, but then the argument is, because remember the question is there good evidence for the existence of God? And I'm going to say, yeah, billions of people have sufficient have evidence for it. They have warrant. Whether or not you have warrant to believe that's true,
you're
actually becomes irrelevant.
Okay. fine, then it's irrelevant. But see, I can't show whether or not you have warrant. At most, I can concede that you may have warrant. But saying billions of people have warrant, therefore it's reasonable, is not an argument.
I'm not actually making it as an argument. I'm saying that this is an artifact of the standard that you're pushing here, right? Because not only is it non-falsifiable, you've now pushed the warranting of it wholly into the subjective realm.
No,
right?
No, this is the thing.
He is doing this. Tyler's absolutely correct. He is doing this. He's just pushed it right into subjective realm. And understand something. Tyler is not, and this is what he just said, he got through saying. I just want to be able to make sure that you understand what he's actually arguing here. He's not saying this is his standard. Okay, he knows it's subjective standard. That's why he doesn't use it. That's why he doesn't argue from it. He doesn't say billions of Christians, have this experience and agree with me. So therefore, that must make what we're saying true. Because anybody in any religion could say the same thing. People in Islam could say it. People in Judaism, people in Buddhism, anyone could actually argue for these kinds of religious experiences. So Tyler isn't arguing for that because he knows it's subjective standard. What he's saying is that Matt is setting the standard up. And he's just now set up a subjective standard that will only be true for the individual in which it happens for. And now Matt is going to twist it back and say, nope, that's not what I'm arguing with. That's exactly what he's arguing. He's just all over the place with it. Let's continue.
This only is in the end of the subjective realm with this special kind of warrant that you're asserting needs to exist because there's a God. I don't think there's a God, and I don't think that this is until such time as
You just hear what he said, right? I don't think there's a God. You said, oh, wait a minute, Brian, didn't you say earlier that his position was that he doesn't think there's enough evidence to be against? That's what he said in debates on the existence of God. He said that he's not going to argue that God does not exist because his position is that the evidence, that he doesn't think the evidence is convincing enough to him that God exists. He's not saying that definitely means God didn't exist. He's just saying it's not enough to convince him that that's the case. Now, he just dogmatically said, I don't think God exists. Now, he used the word think, so obviously he's talking about his opinion. That's fine. But he still asserted it, which is unusual because Matt usually don't. Most of the time, he tries to be careful about making dogmatic assertions because he knows as soon as he does, someone's going to challenge him on it and ask him to prove it. And I'm surprised Tyler didn't, went for it at that point. But this is getting close to when the open dialogue starts to end. Let's continue.
I'm willing to accept anything if somebody, including a God, can demonstrate it. And God should be able to demonstrate it. If God has demonstrated it to you, congratulations. But that does nobody else any good.
This might be a good time to end it. We have 5.
All right. This is the end of the open dialogue segment. Wow. Matt must have really felt challenged by Tyler because he was all over the place more than usual. Now, I think the debate that he has with Braxton Hunter was a very good debate as well. I think Braxton really brought out his bad epistemology in that debate. But I think Tyler did too. And I think Tyler, the thing that I really liked about Tyler in this debate is that he really brought out this falsification issue. Hey, he stuck on it. Once he started on that, he stayed on it until the end of the open dialogue. And they were going back in circles over and over again. Yeah. They were going back and forth in circles. And it's not because of Tyler. Tyler was just simply challenging him on his standard. One, he was trying to nail his standard down, which was about like trying to nail jelly to a wall because his arguments were just all over the place. And he was challenging him on the standard that he keeps setting But then every time he challenged him on it, he would back up and say, no, I'm really saying this. And he challenged that, oh, well, I'm really saying this. Oh, you're not just not getting it. I'm really saying this. His arguments were just all over the place. Now, Matt, is normally inconsistent in the debate, but this was more scatterbrained type argumentation than I've ever seen Matt Dillahunty ever be in. That's good, and it's not good for his arguments, but it's good for Tyler because this kind of exposed the fact that he has got a flawed epistemology. Tyler's challenging that and bringing it out that he has such a bad epistemology. And Matt is trying to avoid that challenge, or at least try to avoid the implications of that challenge, being challenged on it and having that epistemology exposed. So his arguments are all over the place. And I don't know if it was nerves or what it is, but I've seen Matt in debates. He's obviously an experienced debater. He has great rhetorical ability. I wouldn't say that his nerves were bothering him. If he was a new debater and this is his first debate, then I would say it could have been nerves. He just could be all over the place. He didn't know what to deal with. Some of the things he argued, maybe he just didn't know exactly what Tyler's arguments were going to be or something of that nature. I'll try to give him more of a benefit of doubt. But the thing is that Matt has done hundreds of these debates. I mean, he's done a lot of debates. I don't even know how many debates he has, but he's done a lot of debates. He's done a lot of debates. This isn't even his first time on Modern Day Debate. In fact, I did a debate review with Matt of his debate with Jonathan McClatchy, which was on Modern Day Debate. So it's not nerves. Then what is it? It's the fact that Tyler is successfully challenging his arguments and his standard. And he's really pushing for it. And he's probably pushing harder than I've seen anyone else ever. Because usually someone just kind of asks a question and try to see if his view is falsifiable and give some kind of extreme example just to show that even if this extreme example happened, he still wouldn't believe. And then they'll make a point about it and then they move on to other things, other issues. But Tyler stayed with this all the way up until the end of the crossfire. Now, he had other issues before he started this, but once he started this, he stayed on it all the way up until the end of the open dialogue. So he pushed harder on Matt on this particular issue of his faulty epistemological standard of not being convinced and not having something to falsify better and more than anyone else I've ever seen do this before. And Matt is being challenged like I've never seen him challenged. I mean, he's been challenged before by apologists. I've liked a lot of debates that I've seen him in, and they shattered his arguments there too. But Tyler really just brought out that faulty epistemology in this debate. And this is what I wanted to get at because I did a video recently of the faulty epistemology of Matt Dillahunty. I will link that also in the description box below because I think it's relative. Because a lot of the stuff that gets brought in this debate and what gets brought up in other debates of that Matt Dillahunty does, I've often noted that the kind of things that I said in there about his epistemology can be found in other debates, and this debate really brought a lot of that stuff out. His use of "I don't know" his epistemological framework, his faulty epistemology is just totally bad. And Tyler really challenged him on that, and Matt was more scatterbrained than I've ever seen him do before. His arguments were all over the place. I've seen him inconsistent. I've seen him argue one point, and then when he gets challenged, he'll argue another. I've seen him do that in debates. This isn't the first debate he's ever done that. But his arguments were just more all over the place than I'm normally used to seeing to be the case. So Tyler was really challenging him, really pushing the envelope on this. And I thought he did a really good job on that. But anyhow, I'm going to close it out with my closing thoughts, and that'll be it for this debate review. And we're back. All right. Wow. This is one of the best debates I've seen Matt Dillahunty in personally, because it really brought out his epistemology, his faulty epistemology, more than I have seen in any other debate, besides maybe Braxton Hunter's. Braxton Hunter's did a good job of bringing epistemology out as well. But this one really focused on the lack of falsifiableness. Now, other people, as noted by Braxton Hunter in his debate view, has numerously asked him what would falsify his position. I mean, you can go down Jonathan McClatchy, Mike Lacona, Braxton Hunter. You can go to Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. I mean, you can go a long list of people. I think Braxton Hunter went even further back than I'm going right now. And of course, now Tyler Vila also challenged his epistemology, but he did a really good job of really pushing at his lack of falsifiableness that his position has. And I thought he did a really good job in the debate. Matt, of course, was his usual dismissive self, and going back and forth between two different arguments. Like you say, I'm arguing this, and then when you challenge that, I said, no, I'm really arguing this, and but in this debate, I found him to be all over the place. Now, typically, this is a bad debate tactic in which someone tries to make it look like that he's not really arguing this, he's really arguing that. I usually call this redirection or misdirection. I don't know what it's actually called. That's just what I refer to it as. It's a good way to keep your opponent from challenging you, because every time he challenges you, it makes it where he can't pin down your argument. But unfortunately, it becomes confusing to people watching the debate. It becomes confusing because when they're going back and forth, and it's not a good debate tactic to have. And just like misdirection in magic, I mean, or just like a magic trick, Matt Dillahunty's a magician, a professional magician. And magicians don't usually do the same tricks over and over again. Why? Because people can figure out a trick eventually. If you do it enough times in front of them, they'll know, oh, well, he's doing it because he has it up his sleeve, or he's got a trap door here, or something of that nature. They'll eventually figure it out. You do a trick enough time. That's why they try to be very unique and do different tricks, not just for performance reasons, but also it helps with the illusion if you can't figure out how they managed to do what they did. And same thing with this type of argument. I mean, you can only do it so many times. The fact that he not only does it a lot in his debates and in this debate particularly, but he also was going all over the place with his arguments. So it became very obvious that this is what he was doing. So he can try to keep Tyler from pinpointing his argument and grounding it in a stance where he can actually challenge it. Because every time he challenged it, he would go somewhere different. And so Matt was all over the place with his argumentation. And it was terrible way to argue. But the one thing I do want you to get out of this is the faulty epistemology of Matt Dillahunty. The fact that he can't falsify. See, we can falsify. If you ask us what to prove our position false, if they could find such evidence, we could falsify. We could give you reasons that would show that we're wrong about something. But Matt can't give this falsification. He cannot give a reason that would falsify his worldview, his position, his beliefs, what he thinks about God, anything. And then he tries to blame God. Oh, it's God's fault that I'm not convinced. No, it's Matt's fault. And Tyler started bringing these kinds of issues out. You notice that in the debate, in the part that we went over, Tyler is fleshing out these issues of his standard. I mean, if you set your standard up in the way that he does, you can dismiss almost anything. And it's not God's fault that his standards set up that way. It's Matt Dillahunty's fault. And the scientific method, it has limitations to it. It is not a universal methodology by which we can know everything. It is a methodology by which we can approach the world and the universe by. It has limitations. And as Tyler pointed out, the statement itself, that all things can be scientifically proven, it's self-refuting. I mean, he didn't use that term for it, but he basically exposed, yes, it's self-refuting. It winds up defeating itself because it cannot meet its own evidential standard, is the wording he used. And it can't. It can't. How can you prove that all things can be proven scientifically? In other words, by the scientific method. Yeah. I know I usually do a debate review over the entire debate. I didn't want to do it this time. I just want to do it on a certain aspect of it, particularly this one because I just recently did a video, probably within a week or so of this day, and talking about Matt's flawed epistemology is, in that I talked about his epistemological standard. I talked about his use of I don't know and not being convinced, and when he's challenging, he says, I don't know what would convince me. Then your view is not falsifiable. Oh, it's falsifiable because I don't know what would convince me, but maybe God does. That's not an explanation, as Tyler pointed out in the debate. That's not an explanation. You have to give me an actual reason that would falsify. I can give you reasons for what would falsify our position. Tyler mentioned some reasons that he thinks it would falsify his position. Why can't Matt give us reasons what would falsify his? Because it lacks falsify. It literally can't meet its own evidential standard. It can't. It can't meet its own standard. It's a flawed epistemology. It's unsound epistemology. It's just not true. Now, there's a few points here and there I agree with Matt on. We can't use our own experiences to prove the experience of someone else. I agree. That's why we turn to evidence and things like that. But that's what Matt, Tyler was trying to get at. And he was trying to show what he was actually talking about. And Matt kept acting like he just kept missing the point. Kept missing what he was saying. In truth, I wonder if he actually got what he was saying, but intentionally went the routes he did to prevent him from being challenged on it. And once Tyler started challenging him on that, he went somewhere different. Now, usually this is the part where I tell you who I think won this debate. And of course, as I mentioned in the past, I evaluate debates by the weight of the arguments and so forth, because that's what I look for. I don't think the debates ought to be evaluated based on just simply who you just happen to agree with. Now, of course, my criticism during the debate probably made it obvious who I would have sided with, but I just want to make sure that you understand the reason why I would side with him isn't because, or in this case, I do side with Tyler Villa, not because he's a Christian, not because I agree with him on everything. I mean, he's a Calvinist, and I'm not a Calvinist. It's not because I like him better than Matt or something of that nature. It's not that. It's the fact that his arguments were better. He presented stronger arguments. He presented evidence. Matt, of course, as usual, never present evidence. He presents a lot of analogies and things like that. But he doesn't present evidence. He leans a lot to his rhetorical ability, which is very good. But unfortunately, he also illustrates some really bad debate tactics, which it's easy for opponents of his to catch on to what he's trying to do here. And of course, I noticed that his arguments were just all over the place. Not good in debating, because if I'm debating somebody, like I said, my arguments have to be straightforward. Okay, I have these arguments. They support this conclusion, which agrees with this position. All right? I want the person I'm debating to understand what I'm actually arguing. In fact, I want it so much, I'll start clarifying things start defining terms and how I'm using it and how I'm applying it here. I'll put things in parentheses, let them know I'm excluding certain things. I'm not really talking about this over here, but I'm really talking about this over here. And I'll do that because it's important to me to clarify what I'm actually arguing, what I'm actually saying, the position I actually hold to. I don't care if they challenge me on it. I want them to challenge me on it. Because if my arguments can stand up to being challenged, then other people will see that my arguments can stand up to being challenged, and therefore they will likely agree with the argument more if they see that it can withhold being challenged. But Matt, when he gets challenged, he goes other places. He doesn't want to be pinned down and challenged on a particular view. He doesn't want to be pinned down and challenged on his epistemology. He doesn't want to be pinned down and challenged on his standard of evidence. Because once you do, you find out his standard of evidence is unreasonable. His epistemology and positions are non-falsifiable. All of these things just stack up against Matt Dillahunty winning the argument, winning the debate, because his arguments are very bad. I know Matt's not trying to win the debate, okay? And Tyler was probably not trying to win a debate. I get that. We really want to be about truth and getting the issues out there, more so than winning a debate. But the problem is that his arguments were just bad. And Tyler just shattered him on this. Well, I hope you like this debate review. I'm sorry it's not as long as it normally is. I usually do a debate review series sometimes. But in this case, I wanted to just do just a one video episode, one video thing on this particular debate. I am going to be doing a different series. It's either going to be, because I want to start one, and this is probably going to be the likely one I'm going to start, on alleged immoral acts in the Bible that sometimes gets accused by a lot of lay atheists. I want to deal with that. I don't know if that's going to be the next one or if the alleged contradictions in the Bible are going to be the next one. Both of those are important, and I want to deal with both of those. And I've been wanting to do one on alleged Bible contradictions for a long time. But the issue of slavery, alleged slavery in the Bible, really prompted me to go to the Hebrew and check the text out and things like that. And I noticed that skeptics, I don't think skeptics really care that much about the truth. They say they do, but I don't think they do. I think they care more about attacking the Bible, attacking Christianity, attacking some sort of fundamental view that they came out of Christianity for. Willie says they come out of Christianity for, kind of like a King James only mentality, and then they attack that and think that represents mainstream Christianity or something of that nature. And I think that's what they're concerned with. They're not really concerned with truth. They don't look at things like context. They don't look at things like background and original languages and things like that. They don't look at that stuff because they're not really interested what's true and what's not. They're not interested if their attacks are true or not. They're only interested if it looks that way from their position. So that way they can convince other atheists who are already convinced of it that that's the case. And unfortunately, it leads into a lot of bad ideologies, and it leads into a lot of untruths, a lot of falsehoods, a lot of misleading information that's being presented to a lot of lay atheists. And these lay atheists are going out there and they're trying to battle Christian apologists on it, and we're saying you're not looking at the context. You're not looking at the original languages. You're not looking at the manuscripts. You're not looking at the background. You're not looking at the culture and what's going on here. You don't even care about what's going on here. You just care about attacking Christianity. So I think about doing a series specifically on these alleged immoral acts, probably starting with the alleged slavery act, since That's my most recent research on it, since I went all the way back to the Hebrew and everything, and I can read Hebrew, so it would be a treat. I'm thinking maybe doing a PowerPoint presentation on it concerning it. It's would be a big deal. But in the meantime, I do hope you like this video. Please like and subscribe. And to my channel, subscribe to my channel and like this video. Liking it helps the YouTube algorithm. It puts it closer to the top, gets this information out to other people. Subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell so you can be notified every time I produce a video. I produce videos all of the time. Sometimes they're really short ones. Sometimes they're average length. The average length of my videos are usually about an hour or so long. Sometimes they're longer than normal. And, because I like talking about this stuff. I can talk about it for hours on end. But I know that not everybody wants to watch a video, the next several hours. So I try to make it reasonable length. And the most reasonable average to most of my videos are usually about an hour or so long. Okay. But I do make a lot of these videos, and you need to hit the notification bell if you want to be notified of it every time I make a video. That's very important because I make them all the time. So please like this video, subscribe to my channel, hit that notification bell, and as always, let's keep ourselves in the know. Learn the facts the critics don't want you to know. Thank you.